Continuing Cimon from Plutarch's Lives, translated by John Dryden, revised by Arthur Hugh Clough. Gang are emolument. They tell us that Asakas, a Persian, who had traitorously revolted from the king his master, fled to Athens, and there, being harassed by sycophants, who were still accusing him to the people, he applied himself to Cimon for redress, and to gain his favor, laid down in his doorway 2 cups, the one full of gold and the other of silver derricks. Cimon smiled and asked him whether he wished to have Cimon's hired service or his friendship. He replied, his friendship. If so, said he, take away these pieces, for, being your friend, when I shall have occasion for them, I will send and ask for them. The allies of the Athenians began now to be weary of war and military service, willing to have repose and to look after their husbandry and traffic, for they saw their enemies driven out of the country, and did not fear any new vexations from them. They still paid the tax they were assessed at, but did not send men and galleys, as they had done before. This the other Athenian generals wished to constrain them to, and by judicial proceedings against defaulters, and penalties which they inflicted on them, made the government uneasy and even odious. But Cimon practiced a contrary method, and he forced no man to go that was not willing. Well, when you have a war, you should have something that the people can get behind, obviously. But of those that desired to be excused from the service, he took money and vessels unmanned, and let them yield to the temptation of staying at home, to attend to their private business. Now, sometimes when it's right, it's like, it is a temptation, to, but usually wars are not just some self-defense or something. Thus, they lost their military habits and luxury, and their own folly quickly changed them into unwarlike husbandmen and traitors. The D, not the other traitors, When Cimon, continually embarking large numbers of Athenians on board his galleys, thoroughly disciplined them in his expeditions, and ere long made them lords of their own paymasters, the allies whose indolence maintained them, while they thus went sailing about everywhere, and incessantly bearing arms and acquiring skill, began to fear and flatter them, and found themselves after a while allies no longer, but unwittingly became tributaries and slaves. Nor did any man ever do more than Cimon did to humble the pride of the Persian king. He was not content with getting rid of him out of Greece, but, following close at his heels before the barbarians could take breath and recover themselves, he was already at work, and what with his devastations and his forceful reduction of some places, and the revolts and voluntary accession of others, in the end, from Ionia to Pamphylia, all Asia was clear of Persian soldiers. Word being brought him that the royal commanders were lying in wait upon the coast of Pamphylia with a numerous land army and a large fleet, he determined to make the whole sea on his side, the Caledonian islands, so formidable to them that they should never dare to show themselves in it, and setting off from Cnidos and the Triopian headland, rumbling the tumbly here. Of course, I had a lot of tea before starting this. With 200, the Triopian headland with 200 galleys, which had been originally built with particular care by Themistocles for speed and rapid evolutions, and to which he now gave greater width and roomier decks along the sides to move to and fro upon, so as to allow a great number of full-armed soldiers to take part in the engagements and fight from them. He shaped his first of all against the town of Phaselis, which, though inhabited by the Greeks, yet inhabited by the Greeks, would not quit the interest of Persia, but denied his galleys entrance into their port. Upon this, he wasted the country and drew up his army to their very walls. But the soldiers of Chios, who were then serving under him, being ancient friends to the Thessalites, endeavoring to propitiate the general in their behalf, at the same time shot arrows into the town, to which were fastened letters conveying intelligence. At length he concluded peace with them upon the conditions they should pay down 10 talents and follow him against the barbarians. Ephorus says the admiral of the Persian fleet was Tithraustes, and the general of the land army Pherendates. But Callisthenes is positive that Ariomendes, the son of Gobroas, had the supreme command of all the forces. He lay waiting with the whole fleet at the mouth of the river Eurymedon, with no design to fight, but expecting a reinforcement of the 80 Phoenician ships on their way from Cyprus, Cimon. Aware of this, put out to sea, resolved, if they would not fight a battle willingly, to force them to it. The barbarians, seeing this, retired within the mouth of the river to avoid being attacked. But when they saw the Athenians come upon them, notwithstanding their retreat, they met them with 600 ships, as Phanodemus relates, but according to Phoros, only with 350. However, they did nothing worthy such mighty forces, but immediately turned the prows of their galleys towards the shore, where those that came first threw themselves upon the land and fled to their army drawn up thereabout, while the rest perched with their vessel or were taken. By this one may guess at their number, for though a great many escaped out of the fight, and a great many others were sunk, yet 200 galleys were taken by the Athenians. When their land army drew toward the seaside, Cimon was in suspense whether he should venture to try and force his way on shore, as he should thus expose his Greeks, wearied with slaughter in the first engagement, to the swords of the barbarians, who were all fresh men and many times their number. But seeing his men resolute and flushed with victory, he bade them land, though they were not yet cool from their first battle. As soon as they touched ground, they set up a shout and ran upon the enemy, who stood firm and sustained the first shock with great courage, so that the fight was a hard one, and some principal men of the Athenians in rank and courage were slain. At length, though with much ado, they routed the barbarians, and killing some, barbarians is just a word for foreigners, really, that speak a different language, killing some, took others prisoners, and plundered all their tents and pavilions, which were full of rich spoil. Cimon, like a skilled athlete at the games, having in one day carried off 2 victories, wherein he surpassed that of Salamis by sea and that of Plataea by land, was encouraged to try for yet another success, news being brought that Phoenician succors, in number 80 sail, had come in sight at Hudrum. He set off with all speed to find them, while they as yet had not received any certain account of the larger fleet, and were in doubt what to think, so that Thus surprised, they lost all their vessel and most of their men with them. This success of Cimon so daunted the king of Persia that he presently made that celebrated peace, by which he engaged that his army should come no nearer the Grecian sea than the length of a horse's course, and that none of his galleys or vessels of war should appear between the Caenaean and Caledonian isles. Callisthenes, however, says that he did not agree to any such articles, but that, upon the fear this victory gave him, he did in reality thus act, and keep off so far from Greece, that when Pericles with 50 and Ephialtes with 30 galleys cruised beyond the Caledonian isles, they did not discover one Persian vessel, but in the collection were Caturas made of the public acts of the people. There is a draft of this treaty given, and it is told also that of Athens they erected the altar of peace upon this occasion, and decreed particular honors to Callias, who was employed as ambassador to procure the treaty. The people of Athens raised so much money from the spoils of this war, which were publicly sold, that besides other expenses in raising the south wall of the citadel, they laid the foundation of the long walls, not indeed finished till at a latter time, which were called the legs, and the place where they built them being soft and marshy ground, they were forced to sink great weights of stone and rubble to secure the foundation, and did all this out of the money Cimon supplied them with. It was he, likewise, who first embellished the upper city with those fine and ornamental places of exercise and resort, which they afterwards so much frequented and delighted in. He set the market place with the plane trees, and the academy, which was before a bare, dry, and dirty spot, he converted into a well-watered grove, with shady alleys to walk in, and open courses for races, when the Persians, who had made themselves masters of the Chersonese so far from quitting it, called in the people of the interior of Thrace to help them against Cimon, whom they despised for the smallness of his forces. He set upon them with only 4 galleys, and took 13 of theirs. And having driven out the Persians and subdued the Thracians, he made the whole Chersonese the property of Athens. Next he attacked the people of Thasos, who had revolted from the Athenians, and having defeated them in a fight at sea, where he took 33 of their vessels, he took their town by siege, and acquired for the Athenians all the mines of gold on the opposite coast, and the territory dependent on the Thasos. This opened him a fair passage into Macedon, so that he might, as was thought, have acquired a good portion of that country, and because he neglected the opportunity, he was suspected of corruption, and having been bribed off by King Alexander, so by the combination of his adversaries, he was accused of being false to his country. In his defense, he told the judges that he had always shown himself in his public life the friend, not like other men of rich Ionians and Thessalians, to be courted and to receive presents, but of the Lacedaemonians, as he admired, so he wished to imitate the plainness of their habits, their temperance and simplicity of living, which he preferred to any sort of riches, but that he always had been, and still was proud to enrich his country with the spoils of her enemies. Stesimbrotus, making mention of this trial, says that Elpinique, in behalf of her brother, addressed herself to Pericles, because I know how Pericles, there's a in the middle there, but very often there is no letter when you're, the most vehement of his cursors, to whom Pericles answered with a smile, "You are old, Elpinique, to meddle with affairs of this nature." But for the most part, I don't know how you're supposed to say the Greek stuff here because I'm not even sure you're transferring the Latin spelling. However, he proved the mildest of his prosecutors and rose up, but once, all the while, almost as a matter of form to plead against him, Cimon was acquitted. In his public life, after this, he continued, whilst at home, to control and restrain the common people, who would have trampled upon the nobility and drawn all the power and sovereignty to themselves. But when he afterwards was sent out to war, the multitude broke loose, as it were, and overthrew all the ancient laws and customs they hitherto observed, and chiefly at the instigation of Ephialtes, withdrew the cognizance of almost all causes from the Areopagus, so that all jurisdiction now being transferred to them, the government was reduced to a perfect democracy, and this by the help of Pericles, who was already powerful, and unpronounced in favor of the common people. Cimon, when he returned, seeing the authority of this great council so beset, was exceedingly troubled, and endeavored to remedy these disorders by bringing the courts of law to their former state, and restoring the old aristocracy of the time of Cleisthenes. The old aristocracy of the time of Cleisthenes. And of course, it's given an English, if it's now an English word, we can say it English-wise, right? This the others declaimed against with all the vehemence possible, and began to revive those stories concerning him and his sister, and cried out against him as the partisan of the Lacedaemonians. To these calumnies the famous verses of Eupolis, the poet, upon Cimon refer. He was as good as others, that one sees, but he was fond of drinking and of ease, and would at nights to Sparta often roam, leaving his sister desolate at home. But if, though slothful and a drunkard, he could capture so many towns and gain so many victories, certainly if he had been sober and minded his business, there had been no Grecian commander, either before or after him, that could have surpassed him for exploits of war. He was indeed a favourer of the Lacedaemonians, even from his youth, and he gave the names of Lacedaemonius and Eleus to two sons, twins, whom he had, as Stesimbrotus says, by a woman of Praetorium. And some of these things, that some of these names of places and people and stuff later became words in other languages, and are the source of such things like draconian, dude who put his laws on Dracon. He put his laws on, these little four-sided, well, I guess they were pretty big, four-sided figures, and they would write the law on these four-sided figures. By a woman of Praetorium, whence Pericles often upbraided them with their mother's blood. Well, figure of speech, right? He didn't bring out her blood, and but Diodorus, the geographer, asserts that both these and another son of Cimon's, whose name was Thessalus, were born of Isodique, the daughter of Euryptolemus, the son of Megacles. And, well, some people might, though. The Moonchild book, they didn't want her blood to be got by these other people, because they would, use her blood against people, right? Literally use her blood against people. However, this is certain that Cimon was countenanced by Lacedaemonians in opposition to Themistocles, whom they disliked, and while he was yet very young, they endeavored to raise and increase his credit in Athens. This the Athenians perceived at first with pleasure, and the favor the Lacedaemonians showed him was in various ways advantageous to them and their affairs, as at that time they were just rising to power and were occupied in winning the allies to their side, so they seemed not at all offended with the honor and kindness shown to Cimon, who then had the chief management of all the affairs of Greece, and was acceptable to the Lacedaemonians and courteous to the allies. But afterwards the Athenians, grown more powerful, when they saw Cimon so entirely devoted to the Lacedaemonians, began to be angry, for he would always in his speeches prefer them to the Athenians, and upon every occasion when he would reprimand them for a fault or incite them to emulation, he would exclaim, "The Lacedaemonians would not do this." He thus raised the discontent and got him in some degree the hatred of the citizens. But that which ministered chiefly the accusation against him fell out upon the following occasion. In the 4th year of the reign of Archidamus, the son of Zeuxidamus, king of Sparta, there happened in the country of Lacedaemon the greatest earthquake that was known in the memory of man. The earth opened into chasms, and the mountain of Taugetus was so shaken that some of the rocky points of it fell down, and except 5 houses, all the town of Sparta was shattered to pieces. Now, surely somebody could have considered, why these 5 houses, right? And taken more than physical conclusions about that. They say that a little before any motion was perceived, as the young men and the boys just grown up were exercising themselves together in the middle of the portico, a hare of a sudden started out just by them, which the young men, though all naked and daubed with oil, ran after for sport. No sooner were they gone from the place than the gymnasium fell down upon the boys, who had stayed behind, and killed them all. Their tomb is to this day called Cismatias Archidamus, by the present danger made apprehensive of what might follow, and seeing the citizens intent upon removing the most valuable of their goods out of their houses, commanded an alarm to be sounded, as if an enemy were coming upon them, in order that they should collect about him in a body with arms. It was this alone that saved Sparta at that time, for the Helots were got together from the country about, with design to surprise the Spartans and overpower those whom the earthquake had spared. But finding them armed and well prepared, they retired into towns and openly made war with them, gaining over a number of the Laconians of the country districts, while at the same time the Messenians also made an attack upon the Spartans, who therefore dispatched Periclidas to Athens to solicit succors, of whom Aristophanes says in mockery that he came in a red jacket, at the altar seated, with a white face, for men and arms entreated. Remember the Eddie Murphy's, that show may have been even before I was alive, but the clips, this guy in this solid red leather suit, this Ephialtes opposed, protesting that they ought not to raise up or assist a city that was a rival to Athens, but that being down, it were best to keep her so, and let the pride and arrogance of Sparta be trodden under. But Cimon, as Critias says, preferring the safety of Lacedaemon to the aggrandizement of his own country, so persuaded the people that he soon marched out with a large army to their relief. Dion records also the most successful expression which he used to move the Athenians: they ought not to suffer Greece to be lamed, nor their own city to be deprived of her yokefellow. In his return from aiding the Lacedaemonians, he passed with his army through the territory of Corinth, whereupon Lycurgus reproached him for bringing his army into the country without first asking leave of the people. For he that knocks at another man's door ought not to enter the house till the master gives him leave. But you, Corinthians, O Lycurgus, said Cimon, did not knock at the gate of the Cleonaans and Megarians, but broke them down and entered by force, thinking that all places should open to the stronger. And having thus rallied the Corinthian, he passed on with his army. Some time after this, the Lacedaemonians sent a second time to desire succors of the Athenians against the Messenians and Helots, who had seized upon Ithome. But when they came, fearing their boldness and gallantry, of all that came to their assistance, they sent them only back, alleging that they were designing innovations. Well, one thing that people say religiously is, "Oh, no innovation." Well, no, it's not nothing new. It's the ethics, the consciousness is maintained in the new things, or it's that sort of thing. But not really what they were talking about. But the Athenians returned home, enraged at this usage, and vented their anger upon all those who were favorers of the Lacedaemonians, and seizing some slight occasion, they banished Cimon for 10 years, which is the time prescribed to those that are banished by the ostracism. In the meantime, the Lacedaemonians, on their return after freeing Delphi from the Phocians, encamped their army at Tanagra. Whether the Athenians presently marched with design to fight them, Whether the Athenians presently marched with design to fight them. Now, at some point, me or someone else may go back and edit the videos. So, yeah. Maybe I should do that at 10,000 point. Drop off making videos and go edit some of the videos. Cimon also came thither armed and ranged himself among those of his own tribe, which was the Anais, desirous of fighting with the rest against the Spartans. But the council of 500 being informed of this, and frighted at it, his adversaries crying out, he would disorder the army, and bring the Lacedaemonians to Athens, commanded the officers not to receive him, wherefore Cimon left the army, conjuring Euthippus, the Anaphlestynian, and the rest of his companions, who were most suspected as favoring the Lacedaemonians, to behave themselves bravely against their enemies, and by their actions make their innocence evident to their countrymen. These, being in all 100, took the arms of Cimon and followed his advice, and making a body by themselves fought so desperately with the enemy that they were all cut off, leaving the Athenians deep regret for the loss of such brave men and repentance for having so unjustly suspected them. Accordingly, they did not retain their severity towards Cimon, partly upon remembrance of his former service, and partly, perhaps, induced by the juncture of the times, for being defeated at Tanagra in a great battle, and fearing the Peloponnesians would come upon them at the opening of the spring, they recalled Cimon by a decree of which Pericles himself was author. So reasonable were men's resentments in those times, and so moderate their anger, that it always gave way to the public good. Even ambition, the least governable of all human passions, could then yield to the necessities of the state. Cimon, as soon as he returned, put an end to the war and reconciled the two cities. Peace thus established, seeing the Athenians impatient of being idle and eager after the honor and aggrandizement of war, lest they should set upon the Greeks themselves, or with so many ships cruising about the isles and Peloponnesus, they should give occasions to intestine wars or complaints of their allies against them. He equipped 200 galleys with designs to make an attempt upon Egypt and Cyprus, and of course it wasn't called Aegyptos until Aegyptus. How do you spell that? But it basically wasn't called Egypt until the Greeks conquered it. It was called Tahwe. Tart Qsmet. There were other names for Egypt too. Egypt and Cyprus. Purposing by this means to accustom the Athenians to fight against the barbarians and enrich themselves honestly by spoiling those who were the natural enemies of Greece. Well, not everybody is not your friend is your enemy, but whatever. But when all things were prepared and the army ready to embark, Cimon had this dream. It seemed to him that there was a furious bitch barking at him, a female dog. And yeah, people, you're an ass, you're like a donkey, you're a bitch, you're like a female dog. So these terms are pretty much universal, right? Whether they're literal or comparisons or not. And mixed with the barking, a kind of human voice uttered these words, "Come on, for thou shalt shortly be a pleasure to my whelps and me." This dream was hard to interpret, yet Astaphilas of Posidonia, a man skilled in divination and intimate with Cimon, told him that his death was presaged by this vision, which he thus explained: a dog is enemy to him he barks at, and one is always a most pleasure to one's enemies when one is dead. The mixture of human voice with barking signifies the Medes form. The army of the Medes is mixed up of Greeks and barbarians. After this dream, as he was sacrificing to Bacchus, there's a text that's 90-something% the same as, in an objective sense, to the Gospel of John that was written 4 centuries later, in the 90s. And, well, the first version was written in the 90s, and the priest cutting up the victim, a number of ants, taking up the congealed particles of the blood, laid them about Cimon's great toe. This was not observed for a good while, but at the very time when Cimon spied it, the priest came and showed him the liver of the sacrifice imperfect, wanting that part of it called the head, but he could not then recede from the enterprise, so he set sail. 60 of his ships he sent toward Egypt. With the rest he went and fought the king of Persia's fleet, composed of Phoenician and Cilician galleys, recovered all the cities thereabout, and threatened Egypt, designing no less than the entire ruin of the Persian Empire, and the rather for that he was informed. Themistocles was in great repute among the barbarians, having promised the king to lead his army whenever he should make war upon Greece, but Themistocles, it is said, abandoning all hopes of compassing his designs, very much out of the despair of overcoming the valor and good fortune of Cimon, died a voluntary death. Cimon, intent on great designs which he was now to enter upon, keeping his navy about the isle of Cyprus, sent messengers to consult the oracle of Jupiter Ammon upon some secret matter, for it is not known about what they were sent, and the entity would give them no answer, but commanded them to return again, for that Cimon was already with him. Hearing this, they returned to sea, and as soon as they came to the Grecian army, which was then about Egypt, they understood that Cimon was dead, and computing the time of the oracle, they found that his death had been signified, he being then already with what they considered to be gods. He died, some say, of sickness while besieging Kitium in Cyprus, according to others, of a wound he received in a skirmish with the barbarians. When he perceived that he should die, he commanded those under his charge to return, and by no means to let the news of his death be known by the way. This they did with such secrecy that they all came home safe, and neither their enemies nor their allies knew what had happened. Thus, as Phenodemus relates, the Grecian army was, as it were, conducted by Cimon 30 days after he was dead, but after his death there was not one commander among the Greeks that did anything considerable against the barbarians, and instead of uniting against their common enemies, the popular leaders and the partisans of war animated them against one another, to that degree that none could interpret their good offices to reconcile them, and while by their mutual discord they ruined the power of Greece, they gave the Persians time to recover breath and repair all their losses. It is true indeed, Agesilaus carried the arms of Greece into Asia, not the continent, but yeah. But it was a long time after. There were indeed some brief appearances of a war against the king's lieutenants in the maritime provinces, but they all quickly vanished. Before he could perform anything of a monument, he was recalled by fresh civil dissensions and disturbances at home, so that he was forced to leave the Persian king's officers to impose what tribute they pleased on the Greek cities in Asia. The confederates and allies of the Lacedaemonians were, as in the time of Cimon, not so much as a letter carrier or a single horseman was ever seen to come within 400 furlongs of the sea. The monuments, called Cimonian to this day, in Athens, show that his remains were conveyed home, yet the inhabitants of the city Kitium pay particular honor to a certain tomb, which they call the Tomb of Cimon, according to Nausicrates, the rhetorician, who states that in a time of famine, when the crops of their land all failed, they sent to the oracle which commanded them not to forget Cimon, but to give him the honors of a superior being. Such was the Greek commander. And one of the problems that we see again and again and again in history is this, like, what the first mention of Muhammad in the Quran warns about is, are you going to turn your backs when, such and when he's killed or dies? And that's what people do politically. It's if you have this mythology, or if you have an ideology, if you have a political cause, oh well, these people died, or this person died, or we lost the elections, so therefore, no, you got to go beyond that with that sort of stuff. Or why are you doing it in the first place if it's just, of course, people are like that with their cults of secular and religious types.